Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, mesdames et messieurs, bon matin, goedemorgen, dames en heren. Welcome to our breakfast event, co-hosted by the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands in Canada and the Center for International Governance Innovation, or CIGI as we say. My name is Fred Kuntz, I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs at CIGI. In just a moment, our keynote speaker will be properly introduced, followed by his address, and then some question and answer with our distinguished guests, which I'll help to moderate. But first, I'd like to recognize our head table, which includes, of course, our featured speaker, Frans Timmermans, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands, Kees Cole, the Ambassador to Canada of the Netherlands and your co-host, Rohinton Medora, President of CIGI and co-host. We're honored to have with us this morning the Right Honorable Joe Clark, former Prime Minister of Canada. Wim Geerts is Political Director in the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Daniel Jean is Deputy Minister in the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development in the Government of Canada. And Fen Hampson is Director of CIGI's Global Security and Politics Research Program. We also welcome many distinguished guests in the audience from the Government of Canada, from both houses of Parliament and from the private sector, academia and other areas of civil society, and from the diplomatic corps. And in particular, I'd like to recognize that we have with us the ambassadors of Ukraine, Germany, and the European Union. So welcome to all. And I'd now like to call on Dr. Medora to introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you, Fred, and I'd like to join Fred in welcoming you all to this morning session and a discussion on what remains one of the central pillars of international relations and the global governance system that we currently have, which is the Atlantic Alliance, and the formal topic is Transatlantic Relations in light of security challenges, old and new. And who better to address this crowd about that than Minister Frans Timmermans of the Netherlands. Frans Timmermans was schooled in Italy, France, and in the Netherlands as well, in French literature, French language, and European law. He started his career as a diplomat and has spent a lifetime in both public policy and politics, joining the Dutch Parliament in 1998. I should say, in addition to his very formal and scholarly background, I suspect something that prepared him just as much for his current career was that he was manager of the Roda JC football club in the Netherlands as well. Don't bring that up. But it can never hurt. Minister Timmermans has held important positions within Europe and in the Foreign Affairs Ministry, and so is eminently schooled in this topic, both scholarly and practical. And he has also been the Minister of European Affairs in the Dutch government. In 2012, he was appointed Minister of Foreign Affairs, and it is in that capacity that he comes to Canada this time. So welcome to Canada, welcome to this group, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you very much, and I'm so honored to be allowed to speak to such a distinguished group of people here this morning in Ottawa. I was just told by Mr. Clark that when he was Foreign Minister, he never got such a distinguished group to listen to him. I hope I won't disappoint you, because I have read him, and I was always very impressed by his contribution, especially to international relations and about Canada's track record and legacy as a great contributor to the international system, the UN system, to thinking about disarmament, thinking about humanitarian law, thinking about the future of international relations. And I have always been a great admirer of Canada's contribution to these things that are of the essence of the future of mankind, for the future of mankind. And I'm sure that in close cooperation between our two countries, we can advance that agenda, even in these trying times. And I will be talking about these trying times today. I think especially when we are challenged in the security field, we should still be thinking about an agenda of disarmament, nuclear disarmament, the fight against the spread of weapons of mass destruction. I think, paradoxically, the urgency of that agenda increases when there are international tensions. I want to salute one person in particular. I saw she's here, Mieke Bos. She trained with me to become a diplomat. I shan't say how long ago, Mieke, because and it's great. It's great to have her here, especially because her sister is, in fact, my deputy in the Foreign Ministry. So, and she works, if I'm still correct on this, for the DoD here in Ottawa. So, you know, she's another great addition from the Netherlands to Canada's well-being and welfare. And I think there's over 1 million people who originally came from the Netherlands who are now part of Canadian society. So the bond between our two countries has always been strong. Various Dutch municipalities are twinned with towns and cities in Canada, and cultural exchanges are very frequent. During the Second World War, the Dutch royal family found a temporary home in Canada, and in the post-war years in particular, many Dutch people emigrated here. In some cases as brides of Canadian soldiers who had fought against the Nazis, in others as entrepreneurs or farmers looking to start new businesses and build a new life on Canadian soil. During the first week of May, memorial ceremonies are held throughout the Netherlands to commemorate the end of the Second World War. On this very date, in 1945, the industrial port of Delfzijl in the north of the country was liberated by the 5th Armored Division of the 1st Canadian Army. In this special year, Canada commemorates both the centennial of the outbreak of the First World War and the 75th anniversary of the start of the Second World War. All Canadians, and Dutch Canadians in particular, pause to reflect on the extraordinary sacrifices made in liberating the Netherlands and the rest of Europe. Back in the Netherlands, Canadian veterans who are still able march in our memorial parades. The Dutch gratitude to its Canadian liberators has not dimmed in the nearly 70 years since the end of the war, and the bond between our two countries is as strong as ever. The relationship between our countries is not just a matter of historical interest, however. It also, and I truly believe this, holds great significance for the future. The Second World War is one of the historical anchors of our relationship. Recalling that period is very important, not only because we must never forget the sacrifices made by Canadian soldiers for the freedom of the Netherlands and the rest of Western Europe, but also because the events of that time still have great resonance today. The liberation of the Netherlands by Canadian troops marked the start of reconstruction in Western Europe. The post-war period saw the rise of the welfare state and, a little later, the emergence of postmodern societies with a large degree of individual freedom, rights, and a relatively balanced distribution of wealth. I think Canada and the Netherlands really compare in all these aspects, arguably more than we compare with some of our European bordering nations, and as far as Canada is concerned, arguably more than Canada compares to the United States and other bordering nations. An interesting paradox that we are, in some respects, closer than you are to the United States, and that we are to some other nations within the European Union. The historical conflicts of the 20th century had a strong ideological character. In Europe and other parts of the world, it was not only a clash of geopolitical interests, but of two different social models. I'm talking about the post-war period. Communism and liberal democracy, with the totalitarian USSR on the one side and the democratic Western European welfare states on the other. The Cold War was a conflict of fundamental values. The Western alliances that arose after the Second World War defended these values. This is true not only of NATO, but also of what was later to become the European Union and what started as the European Coal and Steel Community. The very idea behind this cooperation was to create interdependence at a level that would preclude the possibility of conflict between states. When the Soviet Union began to disintegrate in 1989 and collapsed in 1991, there was initially a spirit of triumphalism. The famous essay by Francis Fukuyama about the end of history is often wrongly cited, and they did him great injustice. But it is, in some sense, as it was interpreted, an expression of misplaced self-confidence. I don't want to attack Mr. Fukuyama because I admire him greatly, and certainly his recent work on the origins of democratic governance is of great value to any democratic state. But I do want to say that we presumed that conflict would be a thing of the past. And what we've seen, triggered by the conflict in Ukraine, but something that had been building up for a longer period of time, is the re-emergence of the necessity to be active geopolitically. And I think if I look back in the last 20 years, especially from a European perspective, and perhaps this is true for all NATO member states, we thought that this kind of geopolitical action would not be necessary in the future, but it is. It's come back. And for us as professionals, it's probably relatively easy to readapt and to reformulate. It's going to be quite an exercise, but I think we can do it. The weakness in our position is that we have neglected to prepare our populations for this new phenomenon, and that we need to put a lot of effort, I think, immediately into explaining to our populations what is at stake, so that they will give us the mandate to act when we need to act. I believe this challenge is big today for many reasons. First of all, because of the neglect I mentioned before, but I also believe because of the fact that our credibility as Western world, not blaming individual Western states, I'm taking part of the blame on behalf of the Netherlands. The way we acted in the last 15 years has diminished the support we have from our own population for two reasons. One, because we were seen as acting in non-compliance with our own values. I think that if you talk about our values, human rights, democracy, the rule of law, you have to practice what you preach. And some of the excesses we've seen in Iraq, Abu Ghraib, or Guantanamo Bay, or other actions that run counter to these values, have not just given our adversaries ammunition to attack us for having double standards, that I could handle, but it's also weakened the support in our own constituency for what we need to be doing. So we need to go back to our fundamental values and stick to them regardless of the risks we sometimes run. These values are too important and are too fundamental to creating public support for our actions to put them into jeopardy out of political expedience. So that, I think, is the first lesson we need to learn. The second lesson, I think, but this doesn't apply to Canada, but it does apply to Europe, and I think it is interesting to see the contrast between Canada and the European Union, including the Netherlands. Because of what I just said, there is a surge of anti-Americanism in parts of European societies, also in mine, especially on the left and the extreme left of the political spectrum. And this is projected, it is manipulated very, very skillfully by President Putin, and it is projected by people who have said, you know, why should we believe a friend who listens in to the private conversations of our chancellor? Why should we believe a country that says that Russia is not allowed to invade another country, whereas we have seen that country acting along the same lines. I think it is all faulty reasoning, but it works with parts of the population. So I think we need to address that issue. But the far more complicated issue and painful issue is on the right and the extreme right in Europe. And I've seen some examples of it, again, from a politician from my own country today. The hate against the EU is so deeply rooted in the extreme right in Europe that they blame the EU for what is happening in Ukraine, saying that the fact that the EU rushed into an association agreement with Ukraine is the trigger of the intervention by President Putin. First point. Secondly, and by the way, President Putin, at least, he's a strong leader. He stands up for his nation. He stands up for Russians. And all that mixed into something that is seen as attractive by the extreme right in many European nations, including in the Netherlands. And here I believe, on a more fundamental point, the Canadian example could be helpful to all of us. I think it is mind-boggling that a huge nation like Canada, with all its diversities, with so many recent immigrants from all parts of the world, with all their different cultures, can maintain this level of social tranquility and not tolerance, tolerance is actually quite an awful word, and integration of difference, acceptance of difference in this society. It's easier if you have all that space. I'll accept that. But still, I think Canada has a lot to teach us on this front, because we have begun to doubt whether our societies can handle diversity, and diversity has been attacked, especially by the extreme right, and has been attacked especially in circumstances of economic difficulty such as we have experienced in the last 5 years. And what we see in Europe today, and I'll come back to the issue of Ukraine immediately, but this is, for me, a very, very fundamental point linked with current political challenges, but also linked with the ghosts of the past. What we see today in Europe is the re-emergence of an age-old phenomena on the European continent. If things go badly, we go and look for someone to blame. If things go badly, we never look at ourselves, we look at the other. If things go badly, it is always the Jews or the blacks or the Muslims or whoever you can identify as a separate group that has to take the blame. That's the first step. And second step then always becomes slowly and gradually dehumanizing that group, so that at some point it becomes acceptable to say that they should leave society. And we in the Netherlands have reached that point, that a politician says we could do with less people of a certain ethnicity in Dutch society. I would have never thought this possible, but it happened. And it can happen because of the context I have just elaborated upon. And I believe that understanding our history, understanding our past, should teach us to be very vigilant for that sort of development in Europe. And I think that knowing more about Canada's experience in this field, knowing more about this society, which is treated not by the Dutch, but by many others, with a form of extremely benign neglect. Canada's there and Canada's great and everybody loves Canada, but how many people actually know a lot about Canada? I'm not sure. I think people should know more about Canada. And usually in politics, if you know more about a subject, you love it less, but I'm quite sure that knowing more about Canada will increase the appreciation worldwide for Canada. But let me return to the issue of Ukraine. I wanted to mention these 2 points of the extreme right and the extreme left in Europe, because I think it would be wrong to assume that some European nations' reluctance to rush into a confrontation with Russia is only inspired by the fear of losing economic position or trade. Don't underestimate the percentages in the European population who actually are doubtful whether our position is correct and see some merit in the position President Putin has been advocating. I was in Estonia earlier this week on Monday, and even in Estonia, 20% of the population believe that Putin actually has a point. 20% of the Estonian population, where at the same time that nation fears being, the potential next target for this completely unacceptable behavior of Russia. Having said that about the 20% in Estonia, the very, very good news is that all Estonians, also the Russian-speaking Estonians, are loyal to the Estonian state. So that is good news, I think, and that is a message that should be heard in Moscow more clearly than it is today. The fact that because there was a disagreement with the government of Ukraine, Russia decided to simply steal part of that country is a sea change in international relations and will have long-term repercussions for the international system. That's what I meant when I said that geopolitics is back. Are these repercussions completely predictable? Not at all. Because I believe that if I look back at my almost 30 years of experience now with Russia, in Russia and with Russia, Russians, especially President Putin, are brilliant, brilliant at tactics. But one wonders whether they've thought through their strategy. And in my experience, the strategy is a consequence of a series of tactical decisions, whereas usually you would hope that tactics are inspired by a long-term strategy. And I believe it's the other way around in this case, and it's not the only case pertaining to Russia. But it is a particular challenge to us in NATO and the EU to answer that, because of the fact that I believe these are tactical steps which with unpredictable long-term outcomes. We need to prepare for a range of potential outcomes. And that is a particular challenge to us today. We need to resist the temptation to do what apparently President Putin does and go into a Cold War mode. That would be, I believe, unwise. But at the same time, we need to reassure all our NATO partners that Article 5 is not something we just put on paper, but that solidarity in NATO is there and will stay there and will be followed up by all nations, including the Netherlands, if that is necessary. I'm not saying it will be necessary, but given the fact that I'm not sure where this series of tactical steps will lead, we also need to prepare for more serious consequences without neglecting potential better consequences. And this is a particular challenge at a time when defense spending has been cut, at a time when diplomacy sometimes is reduced to economic diplomacy. I believe we all have the responsibility to reinvent diplomacy in this day and age, with all the new instruments we have, digital or not, on the basis of the fact that very old rules of the game of diplomacy have become very relevant again. I think that as developments unfold today, and I'm extremely worried about the latest news we got from Ukraine, I cannot avoid the conclusion that the onus is on President Putin. The Geneva Agreement has been followed up by Ukraine, but has not been followed up by Russia in any sense. They have not taken the steps to de-escalate the situation. They have not withdrawn their troops from the border. They have not used their influence on these separatists or militants or whatever you want to call them who are active in eastern Ukraine. And I believe we have to be very clear about this to Russia. Secondly, I want to set the record straight, because there's been so much propaganda, such an amount of incredible lies about what has happened. I want to set the record straight. It is my firm belief that then President Yanukovych assumed the European Union would say no to an association agreement with Ukraine because he was not going to release Yulia Tymoshenko. And when he saw in the run-up of the Vilnius summit that perhaps the EU was prepared to sign an association agreement, even without the release of Yulia Tymoshenko, he panicked. And so his idea that he could go back to the Ukrainian people and say, you see, you wanted to be partners with Europe, they don't want us. So that he could lay the blame on the European Union. That didn't work, so now he had to change direction, but couldn't explain it to the Ukrainian people. That is why things escalated in Ukrainian society. The complete misinterpretation by Moscow and Yanukovych of the reaction of the Ukrainian people to this change of course by Yanukovych. And the European Union was not set on a course to offer Ukraine EU membership, as the extreme right now says in Europe. The whole idea behind Eastern Partnership is to be able to offer a form of cooperation that does not necessarily have to lead to EU membership. It can, at some stage, but it is not an accession process per se. It is a relationship based on mutual interest, centered on the issue of trade. And also this idea, uttered by the Russians, that the European Union was not prepared to look at Russian interest in this. We offered the Russians time and again to come and talk about what this meant for trade between Ukraine and Russia. And we said that we did not want this to cause a rift in trade between Ukraine, the EU, and Russia. And we needed to talk about how we could put Ukraine in a position to be both a good trading partner of the European Union and Russia. So I believe the onus here again is on Russia and not on the EU. Incidentally, the whole idea of seeing the EU as a threat is very new in Russian politics. All the years I've worked on these issues, NATO was always seen as NATO expansion as a direct threat to Russian interests. But EU, you could play off one EU country against the other and make sure they would not become a threat. But you've seen step by step that, especially after his return in the presidency, President Putin started to see the EU as also a geostrategic animal and not just a weak economic cooperation format. And the whole idea of the Eurasian Union is to copy the EU, including its institutions. But I'll tell you why this will fail, and I'll end on that. The whole idea of the EU, the fundamental principle of the EU, is that even the most powerful state will accept the rule of law, even if this goes counter to its immediate interests. Germany accepts to be outvoted by other countries if that is based on treaty rules. I think this is one of the greatest gifts of countries like Germany to all of us in Europe. It's a great gift of a great nation, of a strong nation, to say, I'm stronger than you are, but I will accept, for the greater good, to be outvoted by you. Now, I'll ask you one simple question. Would you ever envisage Russia saying to the partners in the Eurasian Union, I'm stronger than you, but I will accept being outvoted by you, because that's how the rules work. I'll leave the question. You might want to answer it. Thank you very, very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Minister. You opened your remarks today with a reminder of the long history of excellent relations between Canada and the Netherlands. That resonates very much with me because my parents were among those liberated by the Canadian Army at the end of World War II. And they're fiercely proud Canadian citizens today, but in the Canadian multicultural fashion, which you described so well, remain gently proud of their Dutch heritage, at least the Sinterklaas part, if not that business about Zwarte Piet. But, you know, that is very important for all of us to remember, especially on the eve of Liberation Day, which is Monday in the Netherlands. I'd like to thank you for your remarks on the dangerous situation today in the Ukraine and your analysis of it. You reminded us that one of the ways to remain ready for serious security challenges is to maintain the readiness of the people to deal with all consequences, and that the way to maintain that readiness of the people is to remain true to your democratic and human rights values. A very important lesson. And all of your remarks about the situation and how to continue to remain optimistic that the good old rules of diplomacy can help us find better consequences is, if not a call to arms, a call to action and an important message at this time. So thank you for those remarks. I would also like to thank you on behalf of the Center for International Governance Innovation for offering to host a meeting of our new Global Commission on Internet Governance, which is a process that we hope will help to maintain those important democratic and human rights values, including on the internet. So thank you for your support there. And I'd just like to say on behalf of everyone, I think we would all agree that we would like to say in true multicultural fashion, merci beaucoup, dank u wel, thank you very much.